American Inquisition, Lecture 10. The Hollywood Blacklist and Beyond. The Entertainment Industry Under Fire.
In our last lecture, we looked at Joseph McCarthy, the most well-known figure in the movement that he gave his name to, but a man who never found any communists anywhere, probably never even would have known what a communist looked like. McCarthy was identified, above all, with congressional investigating committees with charges of communism, with the beginnings of a kind of fear that settled over American society. One of the earliest set of hearings that brought McCarthyism to the center of American politics occurred within one of its most glamorous industries, Hollywood, the movie industry. And it's very significant that HUAC established itself as an important agency in the anti-communist crusade by attacking Hollywood, by attacking the movie world. In this lecture, we're going to look at that world. We're going to look at the Hollywood blacklist, at the entertainment industry, and at how this very important segment of American society responded to the political repression of the McCarthy era. The Hollywood blacklist is the stuff of movies even today. It's certainly among the most well-known aspect of the economic sanctions that made McCarthyism so powerful, that made McCarthyism such an effective form of political repression in this country. The early Hollywood hearings, the Hollywood 10 hearings that took place in October 1947, are significant in large part because they were early, because they set the pattern for the future form of American political repression. They set a pattern that could be transferred to other institutions, to other industries. Hollywood was, of course, particularly sensitive as an industry within American society, largely because it depended so heavily on the American public for its support. People could stop going to movies. The box office, as it were, really controlled what Hollywood did, what Hollywood thought. And we'll see throughout our investigation of the impact of McCarthyism on the entertainment industry, a kind of almost obsessive concern, an obsessive sensitivity to the possibility that appearing soft on communists or allowing communist influence or whatever would in some way affect that box office, would some way affect the industry's bottom line. So it's an industry that's very important, and it's an industry that also is setting a pattern. So let's look at it. And let's begin by looking at the hearings that HUAC undertook into quote-unquote communist influence in the movie industry in October 1947. Now, HUAC and other investigating committees, particularly the State of California's own Un-American Activities Committee, had long wanted to investigate movies, had been very interested in the film world for a number of reasons. The most obvious one was that it got a lot of attention. Wow, movie stars, Gary Cooper, getting on the front pages. It was very exciting. It was, congressmen like movie stars too. And they wanted that kind of attention. They were anxious to get celebrities on the stand. Most of those celebrities, however, were not household names. You didn't get to see the big-name stars testifying, really, because one of the reasons why Hollywood was so attractive to congressional anti-communist investigators was the fact that there were communists there. The film community probably had, some estimates range, up to 300 members of the Communist Party. It's unclear whether that's a big number or a small number, but nonetheless, there were certainly, it was, put it this way, the investigators were fishing for communists and they went someplace where they knew they would find them, and they did. There were a number of them who were very active, especially in the professional unions, in the Screenwriters Guild, in the even in the Screen Actors Guild. Because they were communists, because they were concerned about social welfare issues, of course they became active in unions. This was a pattern that we'll see over and over again. Another reason why the investigators were interested in Hollywood was because they thought investigating, exposing, and presumably eradicating communist influence within the film industry would hurt the Communist Party. After all, these people who were involved with the film industry, some screenwriters, directors, were fairly wealthy. You made a good living in Hollywood if you were successful. And these were among the richest people in the American Communist Party. So the investigators assumed that attacking Hollywood communists would help dry up the financial backing of American communism. Most of the Hollywood communists were not movie stars, but rather screenwriters. These were people, the so-called intellectuals of the film community, people, many of them people who had been active as playwrights in New York, moved to Hollywood for the money and became political activists there. Another reason why HUAC was interested in pursuing communism in Hollywood was because some of its members, some of the people it was working with, including within the FBI, were very concerned about the content of American films. They believed that this content was in some way anti-business, that it was in some way anti-American, that it didn't promote the right kind of values, and they felt that the reason for this was communist influence, and that by exposing that communist influence, they might be able to transform the kinds of movies that Hollywood was making into movies that would be friendlier to the business community, to be more in tune with what they considered appropriate values. As the committee and its staff members began to prepare for the hearings, they got a considerable amount of help from the FBI, including photostated copies of the party cards of the most active members of the Communist Party within the film community. One assumes that these documents had been photographed when the FBI conducted one of its quote-unquote black bag jobs. Remember, we've talked about them already, break-ins in which FBI agents would take pictures of membership lists and presumably party cards as well. The committee worked with the FBI in figuring out who to subpoena. It called up 19 of the most active left-wingers in Hollywood. At first, there was considerable support for these people. The film studios repeatedly said that the politics of their employees was none of their business. They believed in free speech. They were afraid that HUAC was trying to dictate, to censor the movies. They claimed they would never be party to anything like a blacklist. A group of Hollywood's brightest stars, people like Humphrey Bogart, Danny Kaye, a number of other very famous movie stars, also supported the people who were called up. They formed an organization called the Committee for the First Amendment. They flew a chartered plane to Washington for the hearings, and they got a lot of publicity in support of the witnesses and critical, in particular, of HUAC's was seen as HUAC's sort of political meddling in the film industry, its attempt to impose some kind of ideological censorship. That support began to erode very quickly as a result of what went on during the hearings. And the hearings were unbelievably rowdy and raucous, with the witnesses screaming at the committee members screaming at the witnesses. Eventually, in some cases, the chair of HUAC calling on federal marshals to remove witnesses from the stand, bodily pulling them up and dragging them out of the hearing room. One of the reasons why these hearings were so rowdy was that all the witnesses who were subpoenaed had prepared statements. Long written statements explaining that they were good Americans, that they believed the committee was un-American and was trampling on free speech, full of these wonderful sort of civil libertarian platitudes. And the committee simply wouldn't let them read their statements. The committee then kept sort of pushing them. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Screenwriters Guild? The witnesses had met before the hearings as a group with their attorneys. They had, I think, 3 different attorneys, including a former attorney general of the state of California, and had discussed all their options. Some of the witnesses had wanted to talk about their politics, to say, yes, I have been in the Communist Party, I'm very proud of myself, I am in the party because of X, Y, and Z, and really sort of explain themselves to the American people. Others, and the Communist Party itself, told them not to do that they should refuse to answer the committee's questions. Their attorneys assured them that if they stood on the First Amendment, they would prevail. There had been a number of earlier Supreme Court cases in the mid-1940s in which the court looked very much like it was going to take a very protective stance toward the First Amendment with regard to issues of communism and anti-communism. And so these people assumed that even if they were cited for contempt and even if they were prosecuted and convicted, that eventually their case would get up to the Supreme Court and they would prevail. So they weren't worried particularly about going to prison. HUAC went through the motions, asked the questions, occasionally got very raucous, but after everybody testified, and there were 10 of them who testified before the hearings were shut down and called off prematurely, not all 19 got called up at this point, what would happen is after the witnesses refused to testify, a member of the HUAC staff would then put into the record a copy of that person's Communist Party card. And that sort of changed the dynamic because many of these witnesses' supporters within the broader film community had assumed that they were, quote-unquote, innocent liberals, hadn't realized that they were actually communists, so that they began to lose a lot of support. They also lost support because they really weren't very well behaved. The hearings were raucous. Both sides were undisciplined and really rather contentious. So, the hearings reflected well neither on HUAC nor on the 10, but nonetheless, it did begin to hurt the overall support within the film industry. And by November, maybe a month or so after the hearings, when it became clear that the 10 were going to be cited by the Congress was going to vote a citation against them for contempt of Congress, and that there would be a trial. The film studios began to fear the impact on the box office. could the movies afford to have quote-unquote communists on their payrolls at a time when, remember, the Cold War is heating up? This is a period when there's a great deal of tension out there in the international arena, and it's beginning to look bad for the film studios, they believed, to have these people on their payrolls. So at a meeting in New York City, a group of studio heads together issued a statement. It's called the Waldorf Statement because it was prepared in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And this statement essentially said, we will never hire communists, and the 10, these people, will have to clear themselves with us before they can be reemployed in our studios. And that was the beginning of the Hollywood blacklist. Even before these people's case was decided in court, and it wasn't really decided, it didn't go through all the levels of legal appeals until 1950. Even that early, the blacklist was put into operation. Eventually, of course, the 10 did go to prison, where they didn't have long sentences. It's mostly 6 months to a year, and they served in fairly comfortable settings. But nonetheless, in a law-abiding society like the United States, somebody who served a prison term is somehow considered not exactly a 100% good citizen, so that it did make a difference to these people. But I think more serious was the imposition of the blacklist. When it first went into operation, of course, it affected the Hollywood 10, most of whom were screenwriters and directors. But it didn't directly affect other people in Hollywood, although some of the more prominent left-wingers began to notice that they were getting less and less work. What finally sort of solidified the blacklist in Hollywood was HUAC's second act when it returned to Hollywood in 1951. At that point, anybody who was an unfriendly witness, who refused to name names, was automatically barred from the film industry. Now, the people who were on the left knew they were vulnerable. So that even before HUAC comes, and sort of at the same time, there's a kind of informal world of clearances, of ways of getting around HUAC. HUAC wasn't the only player here, as we shall see. And people who were afraid that they might be blacklisted often would consult sort of selected lawyers. There were attorneys who were very good at kind of getting you through the routines, especially if you got a subpoena. There were psychotherapists, one in particular, who, quote unquote, helped their patients deal with a blacklist. In other words, these therapists would put enormous amounts of pressure on people to name names, because that was the one way you could continue working in the film industry if you had once been in the Communist Party. There was also a procedure that was developed by the studios and the sort of organized anti-communist network to clear film people, even if they were not necessarily called up by a committee. What's important here is to remember the film industry is incredibly sensitive about its box office. They were terrified of organized boycotts against their films if, for some reason, they had hired an actor or director who would then get publicity, either by being called up or being named in public. And so what the film industry began to do, and this is all sort of sub rosa, they never publicized this, was they would submit the names of prospective actors, directors, sound men, composers, anybody who had anything to do with a picture, it went directly to the American Legion. But in fact, the American Legion was a patriotic organization that was kind of acting as a front for a group, an informal group of professional anti-communists who would then go over these names and using their files, using their contacts within the film world, etc., would decide who could be hired and who would have to clear him or herself. And if this network found that somebody had signed a petition that the Communist Party had circulated or had sent money to the wrong kind of organization, these people, not communists, the communists are being called up by HUAC, but what we're talking about now are people who had a sort of second-level association with people who were associated with communism, people who may have signed their name to a petition to organize a second front in 1943, who just had one woman got into trouble. She sent a telegram to a very famous theatrical group in Moscow, congratulating them on their 50th anniversary or something. It was a professional thing and nothing to do with politics. But nonetheless, she was on the wrong list. And these people had to write letters to the studio heads. They never knew that the professional anti-communist network was behind it, but they had to write letters to their studio heads explaining their political activities. Why did you send that telegram to Moscow? Why did you give money to the veterans of the American Lincoln Brigade? Why did you sign that particular petition? And if the letter didn't satisfy this group of professional anti-communists. And I've seen this correspondence in several places, in people's private papers and in the papers, for example, of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, whose director of research was a very important member of the anti-communist network. I've seen these letters, and the network members write back and forth to each other and sort of say, well, shall we clear Gene Kelly? Or Marlon Brando was another person who had to write letters. And often these people would write more than one letter. The first letter wouldn't work. They'd have to be more explicit. They'd have to write a second letter, a third letter. Finally, most of them managed to clear themselves. But it was obviously a deeply degrading moment in these people's lives to sort of have to say often, well, I did something wrong, when in fact they hadn't done anything wrong. This blacklisting spread from Hollywood to the rest of the broadcast industry, especially to radio and to television, which was just beginning, remember. Of course, anybody who took the Fifth Amendment was automatically blacklisted within the broadcast industry. But the key document here was a booklet called Red Channels, which was published in June 1950 and contained the names of 151 entertainers plus sort of listings of their allegedly subversive connections. This was a publication that had been put out by a group of former FBI agents who had founded an organization mainly designed to disseminate information that they had been collecting while they were in the FBI. They couldn't be used for anything. They wanted to expose people as communists, and they made this a business. They published a newsletter called Counterattack. And when they published Red Channels, what they were doing was assembling all the information they had about people in the entertainment industry. Now, many of these listings were harmless. Again, it's the telegram to the Moscow Art Theater. Some of these people actually had recanted, had become strong anti-communists, and some of these people were, in fact, the most important communists within the entertainment industry. It was a mixed bag. But the one thing about them was they were all blacklisted. They all were unable to work within the entertainment industry. Sometimes they were blacklisted because of a mistaken identity. They had a similar last name to somebody who was in Red Channels. There were other forms in which this blacklisting took place. Some networks, for example, CBS, hired full-time security people who would pass on prospective entertainers. Other advertising agencies, which often packaged programs and producers as well as some networks, would use professional consultants, often people who had been responsible for making charges in the first place. So, in other words, some of the people involved with red channels made a business of it. You would send them, if you were a producer, you'd send them a list of names of people you were planning to use in the next show. And for, I think it was $3 or $5 a name, these guys would vet the names for them. Often they were extremely tough. And one producer later talked about the fact that, I forget, it was probably over half the names he submitted were rejected, including the name of a small child. There were other professional blacklisters involved, including, for example, a supermarket owner in Syracuse who used to write letters to companies that were advertising shows saying, get rid of X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, in my supermarket, I'm going to have little signs saying, this product was produced by a company that has hired some of Stalin's little critters. And he was very successful. His name was Lawrence Johnson. He was very successful. A one-man blacklist. He got a lot of people fired. It was a racket. No question about it. And nonetheless, because of that special sensitivity of the entertainment industry, the blacklisters were able to prevent people from working. They were even able to prevent people from working whose main political activity was not involvement with communism, but opposition to the blacklist. Probably the most important of these individuals was a Texas humorist named John Henry Falk, who was kind of horrified by the blacklisting and ran for office with a slate of other broadcast people who were opposed to the blacklist. They won, and then he got blacklisted. He was essentially forced off the air, even though he was very successful, and actually he's hilariously funny. I've heard him. Nonetheless, this very talented man was simply forced out of the entertainment business. He sued. And during the course of his lawsuit, which lasted throughout the late 50s and wasn't settled until the 1960s, he managed to get on the record testimony about the existence of the blacklist. This was very hard to do because within the entertainment industry, there was massive denial and secrecy. There was a total denial that the blacklist existed, but of course it did. And many of the people, both in Hollywood and in the broadcast industry, were forced out of the business, out of the profession. How they survived is something that we'll look at a little bit later. Clearly, it was hardest for actors who could not disguise themselves under aliases, or like writers, use quote-unquote fronts to do their work. By the late 1950s, the blacklist begins to subside. Probably the key event here was the 1956 Academy Awards, at which a film writer named Robert Rich won the Academy Award for screenwriting. And everybody waits for Robert Rich to get up and take his Oscar, and nobody does. Silence. Where is Robert Rich? Well, Robert Rich, in reality, was Dalton Trumbo, who was one of the Hollywood 10. And that was really something that people began to know. And by the late 50s, by the 1960s, more and more of these people are beginning to be hired, sometimes even hired under their own names, so that by the 1960s, almost everybody who had blacklisted returns to work. The blacklist had lasted roughly 10, 15 years. What kind of an impact did it have? obviously, for some people, disastrous. There were suicides. Some people were forced out of the film industry, out of network TV. Um, with regard to the content of the films and TV programs, it's a lot harder to tell, and we'll look at it in a later lecture. What's interesting, I think, is that this probably could have been avoided. The few cases in which a studio or a station was able to sort of stand up against the blacklist, use somebody who other studios or stations weren't using, turned out to be a piffle plague. In other words, there wasn't a huge public outcry against the use of politically controversial actors or directors or writers. Um, the blacklist was unnecessary, but such was the sensitivity of the film industry that it nonetheless really did blanket the movies and broadcast shows for over a decade. And it's still controversial. There are still moments within the film world where an echo of the blacklist will pop up and where people become extraordinarily upset. I think it shows how amazingly sensitive this whole issue of the economic sanctions of McCarthyism was and still is. And we'll look in our next lecture at some of the other sectors of society where these economic sanctions were imposed. We'll look, in other words, at the academic community, at the legal community, and at regular blue-collar workers, and see the ways in which the anti-communist economic sanctions operated.
After listening to Lecture 10, a student posed this question to Professor Schrecker. Why was the Hollywood blacklist experience particularly difficult? Let's listen to the professor's response.
One of the things that I guess made the Hollywood experience with blacklisting so sensitive and so, I don't want to use the word vicious, but so wrenching emotionally was that many of the blacklisted people were dealing with and living in a community with people who had named their names. And time and again, when you talk to some of these blacklisted people, they'll talk about the difficulty of going to a dinner party, say, at which there's somebody who named their best friend. And do you say something? Do you ignore it? Do you spit on that person and walk out? Um, and even, for example, among the Hollywood 10, who were probably among the most politically active and politically sophisticated people, and certainly the, I don't want to use the word hardest core, but the most dedicated left wingers in Hollywood. There's an incredible split here about how do you treat a friendly witness? You know, do you have any kind of compassion for somebody who's just wasn't strong enough to stand up against the incredible pressure that people facing the committees had to endure? And there's a real split that continues to this day over whether you condemn those people or simply feel sorry for them.
This ends Lecture 10. Remember to visit this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures that you just heard. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply. American Inquisition, Lecture 11. On the Waterfront and in the Schools. Political Tests for Employment.
In our last lecture, we were looking at the way in which the economic sanctions that were such a crucial element in that political repression we call McCarthyism, the way in which those economic sanctions operated in Hollywood and in the rest of the entertainment industry. In this lecture, we're going to look at those economic sanctions in other sectors of American society, in the academic community, in the legal community, and in some of the nation's most important industries. Let's begin, however, by going back to Barrows Dunham. You remember Barrows Dunham. He had gotten up in front of HUAC and refused to answer questions on anything other than his name, his age, and where he lived. Dunham at that time was the chair of the philosophy department of Temple University. Soon after he took the fifth, he lost his job. He was a good teacher. He was apparently considered one of the best teachers at Temple. Nobody had ever complained about his teaching or about his scholarship. He was also a communist, although, of course, that wasn't as well known. In fact, he had left the Communist Party at some point in the mid-1940s, somewhat earlier than most people were leaving the party. Still, when he was called up, he took the fifth, and that was considered simply too embarrassing for Temple University, then still a private school, not as it is now a public institution, to put up with. The university convened a special hearing. The FBI cooperated. They sent the university administration what the FBI called a blind memorandum. This was a list of Barrows Dunham's political associations, what party group he belonged to, where he had given money. But it was, as these blind memorandums were, just typed on a blank sheet of paper so that it wouldn't be known that it had come from the FBI. Dunham cooperated with his university's investigation. He wasn't asked to name names, but just to talk about his own political activities. Nonetheless, he was fired. The university, overruling the wishes of the rest of the faculty, decided that he was too embarrassing to retain. As we shall see, these kinds of political dismissals occurred throughout the late 1940s and 1950s in many different areas of American society, but they were not randomly distributed. They focused almost entirely on people who had some kind of connection with a communist activity or the Communist Party. And so they tended to focus on those areas where people worked that had some kind of attraction for communism, like, as we've already seen with the film industry, the intellectuals, the screenwriters of the film industry, or in areas where communist unions were active. The firings also occurred among people whose jobs were vulnerable, people in government service, including teaching, people, for example, who worked in defense industries or in the waterfront. And I want to emphasize this over and over again, especially where there were left-wing unions that were organizing or had organized. The connection here is very strong. Colleges and universities were very prominent targets. There are a number of reasons here. To begin with, public universities were very vulnerable. Education, higher education, was one of the few areas where state governments actually had some power, had some control, so that ambitious state politicians often would focus on their public universities. Another reason why colleges and universities were prominent targets was because they contained communists. Communism was attractive to intellectuals. Many students and faculty members, not huge numbers, but certainly considerable numbers, had come into contact with communism in the 1930s and 40s. So that, again, remember, the committees, the red baiters, are fishing where the fish are. and the fish were on campus. Another reason why universities and colleges were targeted was that they drew attention. College professors in the 1950s had a great deal of status in the larger society, so that a set of hearings that looked at communist influence at Harvard would get publicity, get a lot of publicity. And as we've already seen, committee members and investigators were, to put it mildly, interested in that. The patterns of dismissal, the patterns, the way in which people were treated by colleges and universities are fairly constant. Universities responded invariably to outside pressures. People were fired, college teachers were fired in response to outside pressures. There are, to my knowledge, no instances of somebody just out of the blue being charged with indoctrinating his or her students or distorting his or her scholarship. In every single instance that I know of, and I've explored maybe 200 of these cases, somebody who lost a job during the McCarthy period lost it because there was some kind of outside pressure, whether it's HUAC coming to town or whether it's the FBI slipping a blind memorandum over the president's desk. Nonetheless, this is terribly important. These people were not fired because of what they did in their classroom or in their laboratories or in their books. There just wasn't that indoctrination. Certainly some of these people may have led on that they were political radicals, but they didn't in any way punish their students or try to convert them in any particularly overt way. There was a problem here for colleges and universities that were going to fire people who were identified as political undesirables by committees or by the FBI. And that problem was that the world of higher education had a tradition of academic freedom, that higher education believed that intellectual inquiry could only take place in a free and open environment, and that professors should not be punished or disciplined in any way for what went on in their classroom as long as they were behaving in a professional way about it. What that meant was that presumably, in accordance with the tradition of academic freedom, people should not be punished for their political views, that people who were communists should not be fired if, in fact, they're teaching molecular biology in a perfectly straightforward way. What they do outside of the classroom, off campus, is their business. However, what we've seen in some of our earlier lectures is the way in which during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, this theory of academic freedom becomes eroded. The initial precedent occurred in the late 1930s and early 40s with the Rapp-Kuder Committee investigations in New York City, which made it very clear that being a member of the Communist Party was somehow unacceptable. Although what's interesting is when people were fired during the Rapp-Kuder investigations, the grounds were not, quote-unquote, belonging to the Communist Party, but, quote, conduct unbecoming a member of the faculty. The key case that made being a communist unacceptable for academics occurred in Seattle at the University of Washington. And it was, again as in Rapp-Kuder, the direct result of a legislative investigating committee, which in 1948 called up a number of university professors in its broader investigation of communist influence within the state of Washington. The professors were then investigated by a faculty committee, which pretty much heard them, and with the exception of one professor who simply refused to talk with the committee, recommended that they all be retained. The president, however, fired 3 of them. The one man who hadn't cooperated with the committee, plus 2 people who admitted that they were at that time members of the Communist Party. There was a huge outcry. But ultimately, the academic community responded by adopting an informal policy of essentially defining communists as unacceptable within academic faculties. A Communist Party member could not teach in an American university. And in fact, all 3 of the fired professors were blacklisted at this period and were unable ever to return to the academic world. But by this point, and here we're getting into the 1949, 1950, the problem is no longer actual Communist Party members on faculties, but Fifth Amendment people, former communists who were, as we have already discussed, unwilling to go through the really torturous process of naming names. People who, in order to avoid going to prison for contempt of Congress, took the Fifth Amendment before a congressional committee. There had been a few Fifth Amendment witnesses in the late 1940s, most of them younger scientists who had had some connection with both the Manhattan Project and the Communist Party. These people didn't have any tenure, and most of them were let go after the hearings. But their cases did not really set major precedents. And it's only in the 1950s that the whole question of Fifth Amendment witnesses becomes important for the academic community when the main congressional investigating committees, remember, there's HUAC, there's the McCarran Committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and the McCarthy's own committee. All 3 of these committees began to hold hearings on higher education in the spring of 1953. At that point, it became very clear that people who were unfriendly witnesses would have to be fired. What's significant is that in every case there was some kind of official investigation, usually by a faculty committee. If the professor who had been an unfriendly witness did not cooperate with the investigators, did not cooperate with the faculty investigating committee, that person was invariably fired. Sometimes, however, people did cooperate, the faculty committee recommended their retention, and they were still fired. It turned out that everybody who was untenured, with one exception, one man at the University of Michigan who didn't have tenure was kept on, although we know from the later testimony of the president of the University of Michigan that, in fact, he was just waiting till the fuss had died down and then he was just going to quietly let this guy go. But, in fact, the guy was such a good scientist that it was impossible to let him go, and he wasn't fired. But in every other case, everybody who didn't have tenure was let go. And many of the people who did have tenure were fired, including somebody at the University of Michigan, a tenured associate professor, who was fired even though he had cooperated fully with Michigan's investigation. It didn't make all that much difference whether you were at a public or a private institution. Public universities were more vulnerable, but nonetheless, private institutions, Reed College, for example, Harvard University, a number of very eminent, important private schools fired people, just as did Ohio State, the University of Michigan, and other public schools. There were also a number of quieter dismissals, in other words, of people who were not necessarily Fifth Amendment witnesses. Some of these people were fired as a result of the FBI's responsibilities program, that program where the FBI was giving information to college presidents and state governors about politically undesirable people on the state payrolls. And my hunch is that this is the way my sixth grade teacher got fired, that a quote-unquote blind memorandum about his political activities may have been handed to the president of the university. In any event, many schools did eliminate people who, although not called up by a committee, were vulnerable to being called up by a committee, were vulnerable to taking the Fifth Amendment, and were vulnerable to embarrassing the school. We don't know how many of these people there were. The documentation on the responsibilities program seems to indicate there were about 100 of them. Often these people are fired not for political reasons. They may be let go because of inadequate scholarship or because they're cutting back in the department. There are a lot of pretexts that were used to get rid of potentially embarrassing faculty members, as well as those who did something as awful as take the Fifth. There was an academic blacklist. Again, as in the entertainment industry, it was secret, but it was very effective. It lasted, again, until the 1960s. By that point, the committees were gone. Most academics realized that blacklisting was a mistake. They realized how serious the problem had been, how deleterious McCarthyism was within an academic context, and most of the people who had been fired during the height of the McCarthy period were able to return to campus, but they had lost maybe 10 years of their lives, maybe 10 years of their most productive moments. We don't know how many books they could have written, how much scholarship they could have done. We simply don't know. There were similar economic sanctions invoked in other white-collar professions. Again, it's the areas where people are most vulnerable. Local governments, for example, responded to the McCarthy period by adopting loyalty programs. They imposed loyalty oaths, and people who were unwilling to take it were often let go. There were purges within local governments, especially of people who were active in left-wing unions. There were some left-wing unions that had been trying to organize in state, local, and federal governments, and activists in those unions were invariably targeted and usually eliminated under some of these loyalty programs. Another group of people whose jobs were on the line during the McCarthy period were teachers. This is because education has been historically a local responsibility and so very vulnerable to local politicians, to journalists, to local activists who have some kind of bee in their bonnet. And there were, in many cases, purges of local school boards, especially when HUAC came to town, as it did in San Francisco, in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in New York City, as did the McCarran Committee, calling up teachers, especially teachers who were active in left-wing teachers' unions. Teachers were often forced to take loyalty oaths, and people who refused to do that could lose their jobs. Another occupational group that had a brush with McCarthyism was the legal community. Here, the issue is a little different because, after all, most lawyers are self-employed, so they couldn't exactly be fired. And the issue that really agitated the legal community was not so much economic sanctions as such, but the right to counsel. It turned out that people who were subpoenaed by committees, people who were in one way or another involved in the anti-communist crusade, people involved in loyalty programs, for example, had a very hard time getting lawyers to take their cases. As a result, most of these people tended to use a sort of small group of left-wing lawyers, many of them people who were in or near the Communist Party. These people tended to find that their other clients began to desert them. That one labor lawyer, for example, told me that as he began to do more and more cases, including the case of the accused spy, Judith Copeland, that his other clients, other labor unions, began to find different lawyers. They simply didn't feel they could afford to be represented by this man and his partner. So not only were the practices of these left-wing lawyers heard, but the attorneys themselves were under attack. They were often called up by the committees themselves. They were investigated by the FBI. Usually their phones were tapped. In large part here, it was because a left-wing legal organization called the National Lawyers Guild was really the only group in America that was questioning the FBI's practices openly. So knowing J. Edgar Hoover's paranoia about criticism, you can imagine how he felt about the National Lawyers Guild and its members, and he really cracked down on these people. At the same time, the rest of the legal community, the rest of the sort of American bar, was very nervous about these left-wing lawyers. There were attempts to disbar them. There were attempts, for example, of the American Bar Association to impose a loyalty oath on its members, so that even though lawyers were not, quote-unquote, fired the way other kinds of workers were, they still suffered economic sanctions during the McCarthy period. Other people in other fields were also affected by these economic sanctions, often in fields where there were very rigidly organized and rigidly administered security programs. Scientists, engineers, and technical workers, for example, were affected by programs in their fields if they worked in defense industries, if they worked with classified materials. Many of these people needed security clearances, needed to be cleared by some kind of industrial security board, or by the federal government in one form or another. Often the Defense Department would clear people in some of these areas. The Atomic Energy Commission, for example, also had a very stringent security program. The Atomic Energy Commission, which was running most of the nuclear weapons labs, also barred a group of left-wing unions from representing workers at its installations. It ran security checks on scientists and often denied clearances to people who had some kind of left-wing or communist connection in their lives. The most well-known case here, the most well-known denial of a security clearance, was that of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the quote-unquote father of the bomb, the man who was the head of the scientific work at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer's case is an interesting one. He had a left-wing background. In the 1930s, when he was teaching at Berkeley, he had a lot of connections to people in the Communist Party, and it's unclear to this day whether he himself was a member. His girlfriend was a communist, his brother was a communist, many of his students were communists, many of his closest friends were communists, his wife was a communist, a lot of connections. During the war, he had several run-ins with the security people on the Manhattan Project, in particular because he had been approached by a friend of his to spy for the Soviet Union. He, of course, refused. And when he later talked to the security people, he sort of fudged it. He was trying to protect his friend, who had been the intermediary here. And as a result, the security people were really very upset with him and very hostile. And the military head of the Manhattan Project had to really pull strings to keep him on the project. After the war, again, he maintains the security clearance, even though it's very clear that if he was somebody who was less eminent, if he was not J. Robert Oppenheimer, father of the bomb, he would have been lost his security clearance years ago. His connections looked incriminating, and eventually, in 1954, he is denied a security clearance largely because he's made too many political enemies. And his political enemies were able finally to prevail and have him denied security clearance. There were other problems that scientists had besides that of getting security clearances. Often they needed to go. Science was a very international community. People all over the world traded information. And during the height of the McCarthy period, it was often very hard for scientists in this country and abroad who had some kind of left-wing ties to get visas or passports, and there was a real problem for scientists there. Another area in which there was a similar kind of security program was within the maritime industry. At the time of the Korean War, the federal government passed a law mandating a so-called port security program that was going to be administered by the Coast Guard, and it screened everybody who worked on a ship. What this program really was designed to do was to destroy a group of left-wing maritime unions. And over the course of its tenure, this port security program cost thousands of sailors and longshoremen, especially people who've been active in these left-wing unions, their jobs. There's not a lot of scholarship about this program, but it clearly probably costs more people their jobs than anything else, except perhaps for the federal government's loyalty security program. Really, thousands of people were affected. Another area in which there were security programs, and here's another area we don't know a lot about, were private corporations. We do know that some companies had policies of automatically firing any of their workers who took the Fifth Amendment before a congressional committee. General Electric, U.S. Steel, and a number of other corporations had such policies in effect. We also know that a number of companies organized their own security programs and hired experts, usually ex-FBI agents or former military intelligence officials. And we know as well that there was a certain amount of blacklisting within the private sphere, and the FBI may have been very much involved here. Again, we don't have a lot of information. It's much harder to obtain information from the private sector than the public. What we do know, however, is that the imposition of political tests for employment were what made McCarthyism so effective. That the administration of this second stage of the two-stage process of political repression, the use of economic sanctions, of firing people from their jobs and then blacklisting them, was uniquely American and uniquely effective and uniquely repressive. Because if you know that you can lose your job if you're too outspoken, if you oppose an anti-communist investigation or whatever, you're not going to be quite as outspoken. And it really had the same impact as something much more serious and much more ostensibly repressive, like throwing people in jail. In other words, the economic sanctions of the McCarthy period were extremely effective. On the other hand, they were secret. And there's a kind of double conspiracy. Both the perpetrators, the people who fired people, and the people who were fired, tried to keep these dismissals as secret. for obvious reasons, the employers didn't want it known that they're collaborating with McCarthyism, and the victims didn't want people to know that they had been accused of having something to do with communism. So there's a lot of secrecy and a lot we simply don't know. And finally, what's interesting here is that the rationalizations that were given often had nothing whatsoever to do with the real reasons why people were being fired. People were being fired because it was seen as too embarrassing, usually, because it hurt the reputation of a company, because it might hurt the box office, whatever. But the rationalizations often had to do with professional requirements or with matters of security. Probably my favorite rationalization was one used by the New York Times. It fired one of its copywriters, and when pressed, the guy had taken the Fifth Amendment, and when pressed, the spokesman for the Times explained that this man was a copywriter in the foreign desk, and so therefore dealt with matters of national security. If he had worked on the sports pages, he could have kept his job. One wonders. In any event, what I think is so interesting here, and we'll look at this in the next lecture, is the way in which supposedly liberal organizations, the New York Times, the academic community, the fairly liberal heads of studios in Hollywood, all of these people were somehow collaborating with McCarthyism. And what I want to look at in our next lecture is the way in which liberals, often passively, contributed to this political repression of the early Cold War.
After listening to Lecture 11, a student posed this question to Professor Schrecker. What kind of purges were instituted in private companies? Let's listen to the professor's response.
The purges of employees in private companies really varied a lot according to what the companies did. For example, it wasn't random. It was where people were who had some kind of communist connection most of the time. And you didn't find a lot of communists in J.P. Morgan or in stock brokerage firms. There weren't a lot of them there. So, you didn't have HUAC calling up bankers and then having bank presidents firing them. Same thing, there weren't a lot of engineers and people like that who were attracted to communism. So you didn't have a lot of firings of high-level technical people, for example, or real estate agents. It really depended on the kinds of occupations that were attractive to communists, or else the industries in which communists had been active in organizing unions.
This ends Lecture 11. American Inquisition, Lecture 12. The Dog That Didn't Bark. The Collapse of the Liberals.
In our last lecture, we explored the political tests for employment that were often administered by moderate and liberal university presidents or studio heads or other people who claimed, in fact, that they were opposing McCarthy, that they were opposed to McCarthyism, even as they imposed the sanctions that made the political repression of the McCarthy period so effective. This is something that puzzled me when I first began to study McCarthyism, and to a certain extent it's still puzzling to me. Why did the liberal center, as it were, collapse? Why wasn't there stronger opposition to McCarthyism in this country? I think there are a number of reasons here. One is that the anti-communist crusade itself was supported by some rather powerful people, by senators and congressmen, by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, by major newspaper publishers. In other words, the right was not weak. In fact, a conservative coalition was in control of Congress and made it impossible for the President of the United States, who was, at that time, a kind of civil libertarian, Harry Truman really did support the Bill of Rights, but he didn't have enough power to defend it. There's another reason why there wasn't a stronger opposition to McCarthyism, and that was in part because the groups that one would ordinarily look to as sort of spearheading a defense of civil liberties were silent. Liberal politicians, the labor movement, even organized civil liberties groups simply held back or made only token gestures in opposition. I think they did so because they were afraid of being marginalized. They were afraid of being seen as quote-unquote soft on communism, but also because they themselves supported that anti-communist consensus, because they themselves believed that communists didn't deserve the Bill of Rights, that communists didn't deserve the protections of the American Constitution. And this was, I think, one major contribution to this success of McCarthyism, because it's very hard to oppose a movement of political repression as an individual. You need organized opposition, and the most obvious sources of that organized opposition were holding back. As a result, the main opposition to McCarthyism came from the people it targeted. The victims themselves were the most effective, or certainly the most active, opponents of McCarthyism. There were only a real handful of sort of non-communist liberals who were willing to defend the rights of communists. This was really key. Later on, after the worst of the McCarthy era had passed, many moderates and liberals began to realize that they had made a mistake, that in a sense civil liberties was indivisible, and that you couldn't protect the civil liberties of some without protecting the civil liberties of all. I want to look first, as I look at the groups that didn't defend the Constitution, to look at an organization. I don't think I'd necessarily call it a civil liberties organization exactly, but an organization that certainly could have prevented most of what we call McCarthyism, and that is the Supreme Court. We're looking here at the judicial branch of the federal government that certainly could have prevented most of the violations of civil liberties that occurred, and yet did not. The court's majority did not really oppose the anti-communist crusade in any significant way until the mid-50s. We've seen this already in some of the early lectures, and I'd like to look at it in a lot more detail now. There were a number of reasons why the court played such a disappointing role here. To begin with, the court was split. We're not talking about 9 justices supporting the anti-communist purges. We're talking about 5, maybe 6. The majority of the court, and it was always, there were no unanimous decisions here. The majority here was, at least until the mid-50s, very concerned about anti-communism. These were conservative people. These were people who shared the national view that communism was in some sense antithetical to American society. In addition, the court's majority believed very strongly that national security overrode individual rights, that as one of the justices put it, and I don't think I'm quoting him directly, the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. At times of great crisis or emergency, the issues of national security took precedence over the rights of individuals, and certainly over the rights of individual communists. Another reason why the court refrained from interfering in some of the anti-communist purges and some of the political repression of this period was the doctrine of judicial restraint. This was a notion that the court should not intervene in political issues, but should allow Congress, in particular, to do what it did. That this was a holdover, in fact, from the 1930s, where the Supreme Court was throwing out New Deal legislation. Now, in the 1950s, this notion of judicial restraint meant that even when Congress was doing something ridiculous, like questioning people about their political activities, that the court shouldn't interfere. Finally, and I think this was not articulated quite as openly as some of the other issues, but I think was something that clearly lurked in the background. The court was, in the late 40s and early 1950s, about to really revolutionize American society. The court was about to declare segregation illegal. And there was a realization on the part of many justices that its rulings in the area of racial equality were going to subject the court to a great deal of criticism. And it may very well be that during this period, the justices were, in a sense, willing to sort of give up the rights of Reds in support of the rights of blacks. I don't think this was ever explicitly stated, but it's very clear that this concern about civil rights and segregation was certainly making the court a little edgy on issues of communism and anti-communism. As a result, the court tended to hold back in dealing with constitutional issues in cases that had to do with communism and anti-communism. In particular, it really tried to avoid what we would call substantive rulings about the First Amendment. In other words, it didn't want to say that a particular act was violating somebody's freedom of speech. And it tended to sort of walk around that issue. When the court finally began to protect people, it did so on what we would call procedural grounds, on issues of, did the committee have the jurisdiction to ask questions? Not whether did the committee impinge on somebody's freedom of speech, but was this within the jurisdiction of the committee? Was this the area in which this particular committee was allowed to be asking questions? So it was ruling on technical issues rather than issues of real freedom of speech. Probably the court's single most important decision was that in the Smith Act prosecution of the leaders of the Communist Party for conspiring to teach and advocate the overthrow of the federal government by force and violence. Think of those words, teach and advocate. That's speech, that's not action. The Smith Act prosecution was based on speech issues. Nobody was accusing leaders of the Communist Party of building bombs. Nobody was even accusing communists of raising money to send to people who were building bombs. They're just talking about revolution. Nonetheless, in 1951, in the decision, it was called Dennis versus the United States, the court decides that this particular piece of legislation, the Smith Act, was constitutional. And the court in this instant relied on a lower court opinion rendered by a very eminent judge named Learned Hand, which essentially talked about a kind of balancing act in which the gravity of the crime or the gravity of the danger had to be balanced against its likelihood. And what the court decided was that clearly the likelihood of the Communist Party mounting a revolution in the United States was rather slender. But given that particular moment in time, and we're talking 1950, 1951, with the Korean War raging, the crisis atmosphere was such that even though it was very unlikely, it was still such an incredible danger that the Smith Act could not be considered unconstitutional. This was, at least in my opinion, a terrible decision, and it was, in the opinion of the dissenting judges, a pretty bad opinion too. And it was one that, unfortunately, it legitimized other aspects of the McCarthy-era furor, allowing people who might otherwise have had hesitations about firing somebody or implementing a loyalty program to realize that if the Supreme Court said that the danger was so great, that maybe then we'd better be more careful about communism. The court also sort of wrote a blank check for the congressional investigating committees. It refused to rule that the First Amendment prohibited the congressional committees from asking their witnesses about their political activities. It never said so in so many words. It often simply refused to take up the cases in which this is what happened. The court did, however, protect the Fifth Amendment, as we have seen. Here, it's a procedural, not a substantive protection. And, of course, it's limited, as we have already seen, by the waiver provision, which meant that if somebody took the Fifth and talked about himself and said, I was in the party in the late 30s, but then I quit because I was so disgusted with what was going on in the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. Then, if that person was then asked, well, who else was in the party with you? In other words, if he was asked to name names, he couldn't then invoke the Fifth Amendment. And the court, though it never again reinforced the waiver doctrine, never really pulled it back. Still, but in 1956, the court's majority had changed, and it did begin to impose more procedural limitations on what congressional committees could do. The pattern was the same with regard for political tests for employment. Here, the main test case, which had to do with the government's loyalty security program, ended in a split decision. It was a 4-4 decision. And that allowed a lower court decision to stand that had approved the loyalty security program. So that, in other words, although many justices were upset about the fact that people could lose their jobs because of the testimony of unknown informers, nonetheless, that program was still allowed to continue. Again, by the late 1950s, the court is granting more and more protections to employees. It's saying things like, you shouldn't have a loyalty security program in an area of the government that has nothing to do with security. This, I think, was the case of a cafeteria worker in the Pentagon. Well, hello, how many, defense secrets was she privileged to? In other words, the court began to limit the scope of some of these political tests for employment. And what we've seen here is a real switch in the mid-50s, in part because the court's majority is becoming more liberal, although it's still split. Also, there's no longer that sense of crisis that existed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The United States doesn't seem to be in the grip of an emergency. The Supreme Court also began to recognize that there were a lot of abuses associated with McCarthyism. It began to throw out cases in which government witnesses had been perjuring themselves. It began to throw out cases in which, for example, in a Smith Act case in California, it was very clear that there was no actual discussion of overthrowing the government. So it's beginning to pull back. Nonetheless, it didn't pull back completely because there was a real backlash, a political backlash against these more liberal rulings. In fact, this backlash was probably against its main ruling of the 1950s, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954, which made school segregation illegal. And in response to this backlash, the court pulls back and begins to, again, allow a lot more anti-communist political repression. This is the period in which, for example, the Supreme Court allows Junius Scales to go to prison simply for belonging to the Communist Party. Eventually, however, by the mid and late 60s, the Supreme Court is no longer allowing the anti-communist crusade to really continue unimpeded. And by that point, you see some fairly liberal opinions here. There were other places in American society besides the Supreme Court where the failure to oppose McCarthyism, in a sense, strengthened McCarthyism. One of those areas was the labor movement. And it was a movement whose anti-communism, at least within the mainstream labor unions, kept it from defending those unions which had been targeted by the McCarthy-era witch hunts. Part of the reason why the labor movement put up such a sort of feeble defense against McCarthyism, even though one could argue that labor was in fact one of the key targets of the McCarthyists, was that there was also a lot of anti-communism, both among liberals and conservatives, in the mainstream labor unions. The Catholic Church, for example, had been very active organizing anti-communist factions within the left-led unions. And you had as well a purge within the CIO, the sort of movement of industrial unions that in 1950 essentially marginalized and expelled a group of communist-led unions. There was also within the labor movement a kind of mixed response here to the main piece of labor legislation of the early Cold War, something called the Taft-Hartley Act, which had been passed in 1948 over Truman's veto as a way of weakening the labor movement as a whole. But Taft-Hartley also contained what were known as anti-communist affidavits that required every union official to sign a statement saying that he or she was no longer in the, I forget how it went, something like, I am not a member of the Communist Party or sympathetic to its doctrines. Again, sympathetic to its doctrines is a very slippery kind of a phrase, and one that clearly is sort of impinging on free speech issues. And there was a recognition at the time that these affidavits clearly would have to be litigated, would be dealt with, would have to go up to the Supreme Court because of this free speech issue. Initially, when these affidavits were instituted, most union leaders, both communist and non-communist and anti-communist, didn't want to sign them. They felt that, why should unions be singled out here? However, when they realized that by 1950 or so, the Supreme Court was not going to overturn the anti-communist affidavits, and when they realized that the Taft-Hartley law was not going to be repealed, and when they realized as well that these affidavits were very useful in weakening the left-wing labor unions that they were eager to eliminate and expel from the labor movement, they quickly sort of backed down and stopped opposing. Taft-Hartley stopped opposing these affidavits. So what you got was a kind of internal warfare within the labor movement where the mainstream labor unions actually turned on a group of left-wing unions that had communists in their leadership. There are about 10 of them. The longshoremen, there was the largest electrical workers union. There were some unions of federal civil servants. There was a mining union. There were a number of small maritime unions, a cannery union, an agricultural union, and the mainstream unions began to oppose these smaller unions and began to raid their memberships, threw them out of mainstream labor organizations, and often organized rival unions, so that you had a lot of infighting that I think ultimately was disastrous for the labor movement, and we'll look at this later, but clearly hurt any kind of opposition to what the McCarthy-era purges were doing in this field of labor and labor organizing. Another area, another group that one would have thought would have put up more of a fight against McCarthyism were liberals. Liberal politicians, liberal organizations, liberal intellectuals, liberals of all kinds. And yet they shrank back. We've seen already that many liberal politicians felt themselves vulnerable. So much of the McCarthy-era attack was directed against the Roosevelt and Truman administrations for being soft on communists. And many liberal politicians were afraid that they too would be attacked as soft on communism if in fact they were too critical of what was going on. Liberals also held back from criticizing the FBI. In fact, they supported the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was very clever and very successful in winning liberal support for the FBI as a professional organization. This is especially in contrast with something like HUAC. HUAC was seen as out of control, right wing. The FBI managed to get itself seen, even though it was out of control and right wing. It still managed to give itself the reputation of being apolitical, professional, and the liberals flocked to it. It gave them a sort of alternative, they thought, to McCarthyism. And the liberals, as a result, often allowed themselves to be, I hate to use the word patsies, but in a sense they really were playing into J. Edgar Hoover's hands. So, for example, when the McCarran Act is up before Congress and it has provisions, really unconstitutional provisions, forcing members of the Communist Party to register with the federal government, a group of liberal senators proposed an alternative to those registration proposals that would have required rounding up and detaining all, quote-unquote, suspected subversives in time of emergency. This was a provision that J. Edgar Hoover was eager to have added to the act, but coming from liberals, it was essentially calling for a concentration camps, internment camps, and clearly not a liberal message. These people were really, in a sense, shell-shocked, especially after the 1950 elections, when it looked as if McCarthy himself was unstoppable. They simply fled, went into the woodwork. In part, they were kind of hamstrung by their own anti-communism again. Similarly, the most important of the liberal political organizations, a group called the Americans for Democratic Action, which was quite liberal in terms of its support for a welfare state, in terms of its hostility to segregation, nonetheless was organized specifically as an anti-communist liberal group, and it focused most of its activities on red baiting, especially in 1948 in the presidential election where it attacked the progressive left-wing candidate Henry Wallace. So you have the most active liberal organizations participating in a way in some of this red baiting and witch hunting. Same thing with the group known as the New York Intellectuals, a group of writers and thinkers some of whom had formerly been on the left, who nonetheless become involved in a number of anti-communist groups and to a certain extent supply intellectual justifications for a lot of what's going on. Even so, you would have thought that somewhere there would have been opposition, certainly perhaps within those groups that were most identified with civil liberties. And yet they weren't. You have the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which during the 1950s was incredibly split over the communist issue. And that those splits meant that the organization itself could provide no leadership in the fight against the worst violations of civil liberties since World War I. Part of the reason was that some of the leaders of the ACLU actually participated in the anti-communist crusade. We know, for example, that one of its staff members in Washington worked directly with the FBI. He was actually informing to the FBI about other people in the civil liberties world. The organization itself, because of these splits, really did very little during the McCarthy period. It didn't get involved the way it does now in litigation. In the first place, it simply refused to defend communists. In a few instances where it did get involved, it refused to handle cases directly, but only submitted what were known as amicus briefs. In other words, they didn't support the defendants, but would write a brief that would deal with some of the issues, maybe not all of the issues in a particular case. And they simply refused to intervene in a number of key cases. They refused, for example, to have anything to do with the Rosenbergs. And in one of the most blatant violations of civil liberties of this period, the prosecution of Owen Lattimore, the ACLU dithered and dithered and dithered about whether to take the case or not for so long that Lattimore's lawyer, who later became a Supreme Court justice, Abe Fortas, finally wrote to the ACLU and said, "Forget about it, I don't need your help." What this meant was that there was really no organized opposition in the field of civil liberties fighting against the worst of the McCarthy era. There were a few left-wing groups, but they were very seriously red-baited and so not particularly active and not particularly effective. They couldn't be. Within the academic community, the main organization that protects academic freedom is a group called the American Association of University Professors. And most academics assumed at the time that professors were being fired as a result of taking the Fifth Amendment or as a result of being identified as communists before various investigating bodies, that the AAUP was going to intervene in their cases and was going to censure the universities. This was its standard procedure. However, the AAUP did nothing. Zip, nothing. The reasons are sort of confused. It seems to have been the case that the executive secretary of the organization was undergoing some kind of mental or emotional problems and was simply not acting. But nonetheless, one would have expected that the AAUP eventually would have stepped in. It did, but much, much later. And what its failure to act did was it kept other faculty groups who might have organized, who might have fought back from doing something because they were expecting the AAUP to step in. What we've seen, in other words, is that in one field after another, the liberals failed to resist McCarthyism in a very effective way. And that failure contributed to McCarthyism. In other words, it was a kind of passive contribution, but nonetheless one that enabled this movement of political repression to become so pervasive and so powerful. Of course, here we're talking about something counterfactual. There is no way to tell how effective a stronger stand would have been. All we know is that that stronger stand was not taken. And it was not taken in part because all of these liberal defenders of American freedom, whatever they thought they were doing, refused to see that freedom as something seamless. They drew a line and said, we will not defend communists. And that, in a sense, sort of began to tear the fabric of American freedom apart. Also, these people had a very limited notion of what McCarthyism was. They simply, whether they were in denial, whether they didn't really understand it, they identified McCarthyism with that first stage of the two-stage process, the identification. They identified it with McCarthy, they identified it with HUAC, and they didn't realize that the imposition of economic sanctions that was often done by liberal college presidents or liberal studio heads or whatever was, in a sense, a major contribution to the political repression that almost all of them later were very sorry had occurred. And what we'll look at in the remaining 2 lectures in this course is the impact of that repression on American society. First on the men and women who were directly affected by it, and then on American society as a whole.
This ends Lecture 12. American Inquisition, Lecture 13. Collateral Damage. Private Lives During the Red Scare.
In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at how the men and women who were affected by McCarthyism coped. We're looking, in other words, at the victims. And we're going to be asking some questions. What did it do to someone's life to be called before a committee or to go to jail or to get blacklisted? We're going to look at people's personal experiences and the way in which these McCarthy-era victims coped with life on the blacklist, life in prison, and a whole range of various problems that being the victim of political repression created for them. You'll recall my 6th grade teacher, a man who disappeared in the middle of the school year because his name was on a list that the FBI handed to his employer. He managed to put together a different but similar career. For a while, he ran a day camp. Then he began to organize a school for autistic children. Finally, and this is somewhat ironic, he returned to the same school that fired him. Remember Junius Scales, the man from North Carolina who went to prison in the early 1960s because he was a member of the Communist Party. When he came out of prison, he left North Carolina. He was a notorious figure there. He moved to New York City and spent the rest of his work life as a printer, an industrial printer. I think working for the New York Times of all places. People responded differently to their lives as victims, and I put the word victims in quotation marks, of the McCarthy period. Their responses differed in part because of their individual personalities. Some people were tough, some people were kind of psyched by the whole thing. Their responses also differed because of the intensity of their political commitment. If they felt that what they were doing was in some way part of a spectrum of political activities, they tended to have a better adaptation responses than people who simply felt personally victimized and damaged. People who got support in many cases from that broader communist movement also sometimes did better. It was easier in many instances to kind of survive economically and socially and even politically if you're living in the middle of a fairly dense community in, say, New York City, rather than if you were the lone left-winger in Columbus, Ohio. But I do want to emphasize that it's very hard to make generalizations here. We're really talking about individuals and their responses to what were, for many of them, the most serious crises in their lives. And it's hard to make generalizations here. Obviously, the most serious kinds of problems these people faced came from criminal prosecutions. About 200 people went to prison. We know that about 100 leading members of the Communist Party were convicted under the Smith Act and served prison sentences. Their sentences range from about 1 to 5 years at most. Few of these people fled from their prison terms. They went underground, like Junius Scales had gone underground, often leaving their families for long periods of time and surviving. And the word really is surviving in quotation marks. They did not have good lives, and many of these people quickly left the Communist Party because of their disillusionment with life underground. But most of the people who did go to prison had relatively mild experiences there. They weren't in prison all that long. Most of them served short terms for either perjury or contempt of Congress. Again, their treatment varied and their response to it varied. Some people did get depressed. Some people cope very well. One man I interviewed told me about how he organized a study group that listened to operas while he was in prison. Others talked about how because they had stood up against congressional investigations and refused to become informers, they were adopted by the mafia ringleaders in prison who also felt the same way about stool pigeons. And so they had a comparatively comparatively uneventful time in prison. Other people, it was much harder. And of course, the worst situation occurred with a man by the name of William Remington, who had been one of the people that Elizabeth Bentley named as being involved with Soviet espionage. He went to prison for perjury and was killed in prison by another inmate. So clearly, prison was a serious problem for many people. Another problem that many of these people faced, if they were not native-born citizens, was the threat of deportation. The government used deportation proceedings against anybody who was not an American citizen, especially Communist Party leaders, left-wing labor leaders, and their non-American spouses, their foreign-born spouses. Deportation proceedings allowed the government to keep these people in detention. And later on, when it became clear that most of them could not be deported, and the reason was because their countries of origin, often they were East European Jews who came from countries that were at that time under communist rule, and their countries of origin refused to accept them. So these people could not be deported, and the government kept them in detention, later on imposed fairly severe parole requirements, requiring them often to check in with the Immigration Naturalization Service at least once a week, which made it rather difficult for people to hold jobs. In many cases, even if people weren't deported, didn't go to prison, the fact of being prosecuted by the government and having a prison sentence hanging over them was a punishment in and of itself. After all, there was an enormous amount of uncertainty. They had to raise money for their defense, for their lawyers. And it's very clear that for these people, even when they didn't go to prison, and I've interviewed a number of these people, simply the fighting their own cases was quite a severe punishment, and created a considerable amount of stress, both for them and their families. But as you'll recall from our earlier lectures, the main sanction imposed during the McCarthy period was economic. People had to deal with the fact of being fired and blacklisted. How did they cope with it? For some people, emigration was an option. If it was possible for them to remain within their particular fields and earn a living, many of these people went overseas. It was, for example, for a group of Hollywood screenwriters an alternative to the blacklist. And there were groups of Hollywood screenwriters and directors who moved almost en masse to Mexico. And they formed their own little community in Mexico City. Later on, a group of them went to Europe. There were a number of screenwriters and directors who lived in England during the blacklist period. They were able to work on their film scripts wherever they were living, so that wasn't an issue. Another group of people who emigrated were scientists. They were able to practice their science in places as far afield as India, Israel, England, and a few who probably were involved with Soviet espionage were fled to Soviet bloc countries and lived there during the blacklist period. Many of these people, however, many of the McCarthy-era victims, however, were unable to emigrate because after 1950 they were unable to get passports. The government refused to give passports to people who were, in one way or another, considered subversive. So they had to find alternative forms of employment. For screenwriters, it turned out to be possible to continue writing movies under pseudonyms, under aliases. Some people took as many as 3 or 4 different pseudonyms. Other people used what came to be called fronts, real people who allowed these blacklistees to use them as a kind of go-betweens. In other words, the fronts would meet with the film studios. They'd have social security numbers. They'd cash the checks and then give the money to the blacklisted screenwriters. These aliases became fairly widely known by the mid-50s, especially after the Academy Awards ceremony of 1956, in which a screenwriter named Robert Rich won the Academy Award for the screenplay of a film called The Brave Ones. And as his name is announced and the envelope is being handed out, nobody shows up. There was no Robert Rich because, in fact, Robert Rich was the alias of Dalton Trumbo, a screenwriter who had been one of the original Hollywood 10 who had been blacklisted. So that wasn't always a particularly successful ploy for blacklisted entertainers, certainly for actors. It was impossible to find a front, although some actors were able to remain employed on Broadway, which did not have a blacklist, unlike Hollywood or the broadcasting industry. There were also a number of kind of strange little niches where people who were affected by the McCarthy era congregated. For example, in Washington, D.C., a number of blacklisted federal employees went into the laundromat business. And so Washington, D.C. laundromats for a while were run by former communists and other blacklistees. In New York City, for example, there was a man who ran a newsletter for the pharmaceutical industry who hired blacklisted writers and teachers and people like that. Sometimes people changed occupations and went into new fields. Often those fields were related. So, for example, a psychology professor who was fired from Hunter College became a psychotherapist. A music professor who was fired from the University of Illinois became a piano teacher. A editor who was fired from a major publishing house then went on to establish his own small independent publishing house. Eventually, most of these people did return to their original careers. Like my own 6th grade teacher, they were able to go back into their original profession, but they had lost many years in the process, and their careers, as many of these people told me, never quite got back to where they had been. There was a loss here. Now, how did the experience of being publicly pilloried, of losing one's job, of being under the threat of prison or deportation affect people's personal lives and their families. Again, there's an enormous range of variation here. The human psyche is, as we know, very varied. And the psychological toll that it took on individuals really did vary enormously. At one extreme, some people committed suicide. They simply couldn't handle it. There was a scientist at Stanford who was called up in the mid-50s, and the day before he was to appear before HUAC, he killed himself, leaving a really pathetic suicide note saying that he simply couldn't handle it. At the other extreme were people who told me that they felt that this created opportunities for personal growth, for exploring other sides of themselves, for sort of going beyond the kind of ruts that they thought they were in. I think most people sort of fell somewhere between those two extremes. People who had strong support systems, who had groups of like-minded individuals who could help them out either economically, socially, often found themselves in situations that were difficult. You know, very few people talked about being on the blacklist as a blessing. They were difficult. They certainly suffered economically, but they managed. They coped. It seems to have been hardest, perhaps, for the people who were quote-unquote innocent victims, who had not really been politically involved, who were somehow swept up in this anti-communist furor. They didn't have the support systems. They didn't have, in a sense, the political analysis that in many cases enabled people to deal with it. I've interviewed some people who said, yeah, this was hard, but after all, we were communists. We were expecting this. We knew that there was repression. So those people, my own sense is, managed a little bit better than the people who were blindsided by it and were really found themselves and their careers destroyed. But many of these people were not single individuals, but had wives and husbands, had children, and their cases often had a very serious impact on their family lives. The stress that accompanied what was happening to them, the changed circumstances, often, especially in cases where somebody's marriage wasn't so great to begin with, led to divorces. And many of the people I've interviewed, many of the memoirs, talk about the McCarthy era experiences as precipitating a divorce and breakup of the family. In some cases, it was because wives just couldn't handle the economic consequences, or else, interestingly, I interviewed one couple, both the husband and the wife sort of triangulated on the reasons for their divorce. And one of the reasons was that the wife was able to get a job. And so she began to develop a career on her own and realized that, as her career was taking off, she became very successful in her field. Her husband's was languishing, and that disjuncture simply tore the marriage apart. In many cases, however, wives discovered that they too would be blacklisted, that somebody going into teaching, for example, would find that their own ability to get a job would be compromised by their husband's cases. Another problem that people had was that in some cases, remember that fear that occurred during the McCarthy period, it was contagious. And people's family members, their friends, their colleagues began to be afraid that they would be affected by associating with these sort of pariahs, these McCarthy-era victims, and so they cut off contact with them. I don't know how many people I talked to or read their memoirs who talked about instances in which somebody they knew would be walking down the street and cross the street rather than have to say hello to them. This was common. People felt that their former friends, I remember one person used the phrase, fled like rabbits to the hills. And this was very painful, to have your own family disown you, refuse to have anything to do with you. Children were affected too, especially the children of people who went to prison or whose parents fled into the underground. One fairly well-known Communist Party leader went underground for about 2 years, sent her son to live with her mother. I mean, this seems quite incredible to me, but these people really responded to the McCarthy era as if it was the beginning of fascism, I guess. Obviously, these children had a hard time. And many of these so-called red diaper babies, that's what they were called, the children of communists, recall somewhat blighted childhoods in which they feared, in many cases, that their parents might be killed, like the Rosenbergs. They tended to identify with the children of the Rosenbergs and, in many cases, have these very acute memories of being afraid that their parents would be picked up and murdered. Parents would tell them not to talk to strangers, be careful, don't open the door, the FBI is there. And the FBI was there for some people, especially for the children of Communist Party members who had fled and gone underground. The FBI would often follow these children around to their summer camps, to school, in the hopes that maybe the absent parent would show up for a meeting or something. Other red diaper babies remembered that as they were growing up, the parents would hide left-wing books in the basement behind other books in the bookshelves or burn their books. Many of these children also remembered, again, a very different kind of childhood, a childhood in which their parents talked politics at home, in which their parents were politically active, and imbued them with the same kind of politics, so that many of these red diaper babies, although growing up in an atmosphere of some tension and some fear, also became political activists themselves. They followed their parents' footsteps, some of them even becoming very active in the New Left in the 1960s. In many cases, these were people who were very much part of a kind of left-wing network that even during the darkest of the McCarthy era sustained people in their political beliefs. And so I'd like to look finally at how these individuals, who were, after all, the most active, politically active people on the left in their generation, sustained that political activity. For many of them, of course, their main political activity was fighting their own cases, was fighting McCarthyism. Many of these people saw, for example, taking the Fifth Amendment before HUAC and the other investigating committees as part of a fight back in a broader political struggle. They would go around the country fundraising, making speeches, and trying to enlist support against the kinds of repression that McCarthyism represented. But many of these people were active as well in other movements. They continued to struggle for racial equality. They tried to work in the remnants of the peace movement, although this was very difficult. And it was difficult because they knew that as publicly identified subversives, their participation in any kind of political movement might open that movement to being red-baited. And so for many of these people, they pulled back. They became less politically active. They simply felt that they were kind of a kiss of death to whatever organization they joined. for many of these people as well, and we have to remember that most of them had at one time or another been in the Communist Party, they began to distance themselves from that party. There were a number of reasons. One, of course, is the Cold War. Communism was now the official enemy. They no longer could see being in the Communist Party as a politically useful form of activity. They were afraid. Being a communist in Cold War America is exposing yourself to all kinds of political repression. But I think equally important, these people became disillusioned with the Communist Party. They could no longer conceal from themselves what was going on in the Soviet Union. And even though they had practiced a kind of cognitive dissonance during their Communist Party membership, refusing to admit what was going on in Russia, after 1956 in particular, when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, gave a very important speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Union in Russia, where he began to talk about Stalin's crimes and admitted that terrible things had gone on in the Soviet Union, that these purges within the Soviet Union had been horrendous. Many American communists left the party. They tried to reform it, they couldn't, and they simply dropped out. So that by the mid-1950s, many of the McCarthy-era victims had given up politics, had become, they may not have changed their sort of basic political orientation, but they were no longer politically active. They were, after all, at a different place in their lives. You know, many people had joined as students. Now they were adults. They were had families. They had careers. They had a lot of other concerns. And also, I think they gave up politics because they realized that their identification with American communism would hurt whatever political organizations they joined. And I'd like to come back to this in our next and final lecture when we begin to look at the long-term, broader impact of McCarthyism, not just on the individual victims, but on American society as a whole.
This ends Lecture 13. American Inquisition, Lecture 14. McCarthyism and American Democracy. What were the costs?
In today's lecture, we're going to be wrapping things up, and we're going to be looking at the costs of McCarthyism. What was its impact on American society? This is a very difficult kind of a question to answer. And as we go over some of that impact, as we look at different institutions, different sectors of American society, I want you to keep in mind that what I'm talking about, I'm going to be sort of focusing on some areas of American society, but I want to stress that I don't think McCarthyism was responsible for everything bad that ever happened in the United States since the late 1940s. The impact of McCarthyism was considerable, but I don't want to over-exaggerate that impact. A lot of things would have happened, McCarthyism or no McCarthyism. And so, as I talk about some of the things that I think McCarthyism may have done, some of the ways in which McCarthyism may have shaped the way we look at the world today, I really want to keep stressing that this is one influence, one impact, but that it's not responsible for everything. Let's start, I think, by kind of looking at turning points. The late 1940s, the period at which this anti-communist furor begins to build up within the American political system, was a moment that many historians view as a kind of turning point, as a moment of opportunity, as a moment when there are a number of options, or there seem to be a number of options within the political system, especially in the domestic sphere, in which perhaps the New Deal that had gotten underway during the 1930s was on the verge of expansion, that the welfare state that had just been put in place, that, with things like Social Security, might well expand as it did in Europe during this same period, and that the United States might become a more democratic society than it already was. This didn't happen. And we'll look at some of the problems here, sort of narrowing the options for creating a more democratic society that didn't occur. Was not just because McCarthyism destroyed alternatives, political alternatives that were out there. There were other reasons as well. The Cold War, in particular, shifted American priorities from expanding opportunities within the United States, especially with regard to racial issues. Also, America during the 1950s and 60s entered a period of incredible economic growth and prosperity, so that, in a sense, the political system did not have to provide for people's welfare. This was being done in the private sector, so that alternatives that for a generation coming out of the Depression and the New Deal seemed unnecessary by the 1950s really weren't very much on the front burner anymore. Many historians look at the late 1940s as a turning point, as a moment of opportunity when it might have been possible to expand the welfare state, to create a more democratic and inclusive society, to create a society that offered opportunity to all its citizens, to women, to members of minority groups. This did not occur. It didn't occur until the 1960s. Partly it didn't occur because of McCarthyism, but also I think we have to look at broader reasons as well. This was a moment of incredible prosperity in which a Depression influenced generation was finding itself able to buy cars, to buy houses, to live in ways that would have seemed impossible to their parents, so that you didn't have that pressure for political reform that had existed during earlier periods. You also had the Cold War, which created an enormous amount of tension within the American public and made it much harder to envision political reforms. McCarthyism, therefore, had an impact, but it didn't have a total impact. And its impact, and this is what makes it so hard to pin down, was often in things that did not happen. Not things that happened, but things that did not happen. Unions that didn't get organized, books that didn't get written or published, political organizations that did not become established. So that it's very hard, I think, for us to really look for in the broadest sense, the impact of McCarthyism. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And in the next few minutes, I want to look in particular at some of those areas of American life in which I do think McCarthyism had an impact. Certainly that area of American life in which we know that McCarthyism had an enormous impact was on the political left. McCarthyism helped destroy the influence of communism within American life. And it had an impact on the broader left as well, in large part because during the 1930s and 1940s, the Communist Party dominated the American left, so that an attack on communism turned out to be an attack pretty much on the entire left. Now, it's important to realize that McCarthyism was not the only factor in the destruction of the influence of American communism. The Cold War and the party's own liabilities, its top-down lack of democracy, its increasingly rigid view of American society, its attachment, what can we say, its domination, I guess, by the Soviet Union, were certainly also key factors, very important factors. But McCarthyism affected the Communist Party in particular because it forced the party to focus on its own defense. Its leaders, after all, were being prosecuted under the Smith Act, and as a result, it tended to abandon its other activities. In particular, it was very hard for the party to recruit anybody who wasn't an undercover informant for the FBI. And the FBI had a major impact on the Communist Party's destruction through its 1956 program called COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence program, which was a program designed specifically to disrupt the Communist Party through what we would call dirty tricks. The FBI would send poison pen letters to people's employers. It would disrupt meetings. It did what it called planting, quote unquote, snitch jackets on members of the party, which were forged letters that implied that somebody was an informer for the FBI, which of course would have that person be expelled from the party. So it was incredibly disruptive. And these programs, COINTEL programs, began to expand in the 1950s against other left-wing groups. There were COINTEL programs against the New Left, against the Civil Rights Movement, against the Ku Klux Klan, against the Black Panthers, expanding out from the FBI's attempts to disrupt the Communist Party. Besides the Communist Party, the other institutions within American life that sustained the most damage as a result of McCarthyism was probably the labor movement. And to a certain extent, and here I don't want to over-exaggerate things, we're feeling the impact today when we look at a labor movement that had once organized about 35% of the American workforce, and it's now down to about 16% or less and declining. McCarthyism hurt the labor movement in large part because it was directed against and hurt a group of left-led unions. And we've talked about this earlier. These were unions in a number of fields: electrical workers, hard rock miners like copper miners, federal employees, unions that were led in many cases by people in or near the Communist Party. And it was a combination of attacks on the part of the federal government, on the part of employers, and on the labor movement's own internal purges that really damaged, if not in many cases actually destroyed, these unions. They disappeared from the scene, and I think their disappearance really affected the broader labor movement in a number of ways. To begin with, the mainstream labor movement was diverted by its opposition to these left-wing unions. As a result, for example, it in the late 1940s, it didn't mount a very strong campaign against the Taft-Hartley law. And it didn't focus so much on organizing workers outside the labor movement as it did on raiding the memberships of these left-wing unions. And those sort of intra-union battles really weakened the labor movement, the broader labor movement as a whole. In particular, by raiding these communist-led unions and really damaging them, what happened was the broader labor movement began to ignore those segments of the workforce that the communist-led unions had been in the forefront of working with. These unions had been organizing women workers, they had been organizing minority workers, they had been organizing non-traditional workers like teachers, like white-collar workers, people who were not seen as within the mainstream of the labor movement, but who today are absolutely crucial if the American labor movement is to actually survive. The destruction of these left-wing unions also changed the labor movement in other ways because these left-wing unions had a broader impact. Because they were, in fact, sort of part of a broader left-wing movement, they had a broader agenda than just sort of bread and butter issues like wages and benefits. They were concerned with social welfare issues like health insurance, like racial equality. And the destruction of these unions destroyed those institutions, the left wing of the labor movement, that were most dedicated to expanding the welfare state, and so narrowed the political agenda within this country. McCarthyism also hurt other social movements in this country. It hurt the civil rights movement, for example. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, a number of left-wing labor unions in places like Detroit, Michigan, or Winston-Salem, North Carolina, had been actively recruiting minority group members, and in the process had been acting like civil rights groups. They had pushed for voting rights, especially in North Carolina. They had been really active in trying to seek economic benefits for poorly paid minority group workers. And they had, in fact, urged their members to join civil rights organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which was the main civil rights organization at this time. And the destruction of these left-wing unions meant that the civil rights movement lost a kind of base within the African American working class. That the civil rights movement changed its orientation and became much more middle class. It dropped the economic agenda that it had had during the late 1940s, when it was more associated with this kind of working class, union-based social movement. It no longer pressed economic issues, but began to organize around issues of the desegregation of public facilities, of schools, and voting rights. These were more middle-class issues. And so as a result, in part because of McCarthyism, the mainstream civil rights movement that emerged in the late 1950s and 1960s was one that had a much narrower agenda. It was no longer pushing for economic equality. I think we may see those consequences today. At the same time, of course, what one has to realize is that the somewhat more timid civil rights movement was itself being red-baited. Segregationist politicians borrowed techniques from McCarthyism, and they too demanded membership lists. They too organized un-American activities committees that treated the NAACP, for example, the way HUAC was treating the Communist Party. So that the civil rights movement was very much affected by McCarthyism here. J. Edgar Hoover, for example, who was, I think we can say, something of a racist, worried throughout the 1960s that the Communist Party was somehow behind the scenes in the civil rights movement. And his concern about communist influence within the civil rights movement led him to harass Martin Luther King Jr. We know very well that the FBI had tapped Martin Luther King's phone, had planted bugs in his hotel rooms, and that the FBI was playing a lot of dirty tricks, including sending tapes of Martin Luther King's extramarital escapades to his own wife as a way of essentially damaging the civil rights movement. Another movement that was affected here by the McCarthy period, and again, let me stress, I don't want to say that McCarthyism was responsible for everything, was the women's movement during the 1930s and 1940s, which is a period that is seen by women's historians as a kind of lull in feminist activity. It turns out that many politically active women were active within the Communist Party and within the left. For example, the two leading women's historians of the 1950s and 60s were both members of the Communist Party. And communism seems to have been a haven for people who were aware of women's issues. Betty Friedan, who many people consider the kind of mother of second-wave feminism because of her 1963 book about the quote-unquote feminine mystique, had in fact been in or near the Communist Party. We're not completely sure. But in the late 1940s, she was working as a writer for the left-wing Electrical Workers Union and writing pamphlets about women's issues, about how women had a double burden of family responsibilities as well as workplace responsibilities, and had come to a feminist consciousness, perhaps because of her left-wing affiliations. What's interesting is that, in a sense, she's an indirect victim of McCarthyism. She was never officially identified, but she lost her job with the union newspaper because the union itself was being destroyed by McCarthyism and simply had to pull back. The union itself was being damaged by McCarthyism and had to slim down. It had to fire a number of staff members, and so she lost her job. She herself never admitted that she had been involved with the left, and when she becomes a public feminist in the early 1960s, she no longer deals with the kinds of workplace issues that she had once dealt with in her earlier career. She deals mainly with the issues of middle-class, well-educated housewives, not the working women and working-class women and even black women that she had been writing about earlier. Another area in which McCarthyism left scars was that of American foreign policy. You may recall from some of our earlier lecturers that we talked about a McCarthyist scenario of the quote-unquote loss of China, the notion that there were communist-influenced bureaucrats within the State Department who had somehow sold China to Mao Zedong. These people were all fired and lost their jobs during the McCarthy era. And no surprise, the impact of these firings on those Foreign Service officers left behind in the State Department was to make them, to put it mildly, somewhat cautious. They would not disagree with their superiors about policy issues. They sent memos that they assumed would be what their superiors wanted to hear rather than dealing with what was happening on the ground. And this was especially the case for State Department officers who dealt with East Asia, and that had very serious repercussions because there were other places in East Asia in which communists were active, i.e. Vietnam. And again, I don't want to over-exaggerate and say that the timidity within the federal government, that the purge of the China hands during the McCarthy era imposed led to the war in Vietnam. But it certainly was an element. In his memoirs, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who was one of the main actors bringing the United States into the Vietnam quagmire, talks of a fear on the part of members of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations of being subjected to another Inquisition like that the Truman administration faced over the quote-unquote loss of China. There was a real fear on the part of both Kennedy and Johnson that if they pulled out of Vietnam, that their enemies within the Republican Party, within Congress, would attack them the way McCarthy had attacked Truman. So clearly, in that area of American life, the shadow of McCarthyism hung very heavily. In other areas of life, it's much harder to find that shadow. Within American culture, for example, during the 1950s, American culture was attacked as bland, as conventional. It was apolitical. It was conformist. Was this the effect of McCarthyism? Again, how do we know? Things that didn't happen are very hard to measure. Within the entertainment industry, for example, the effect of that blacklist of the McCarthy era is very hard to pin down if we're looking at content. At the kinds of films that were made, at the kinds of television programs that were produced. How can we say that McCarthyism led to an emphasis on biblical epics, westerns, musicals? Perhaps, but we don't know. And it's important to remember that Hollywood during this period is undergoing considerable economic stress. After all, it's for the first time facing competition from television. There had also been a major legal case that affected the studios enormously because they lost control of movie theaters. So that they're under a lot of economic pressure. At the same time, and they no longer do produce what were known as social problem films that many of the blacklisted people had been involved with. But it turns out that social problem films had not been great box office successes anyhow. So it's entirely possible that McCarthyism or not, these films would have not been produced. Similarly, with regard to television, which is just beginning to take form as a mass media during the 1950s, it's very hard to pinpoint the influence of McCarthyism. Did McCarthyism make TV bland, non-confrontational? We simply don't know. Within the academic community, within the intellectual community, again, it's hard to pinpoint the impact of McCarthyism. This is a period within my own field of American history. It's known as consensus history. People tended to view America as having its own unique culture. There was a glossing over of problems like that, racial divide, for example. There was a depoliticization of many fields in the social sciences. Literature was dominated by a form of analysis called new criticism, in which literary critics looked only at the text and avoided looking at the broader society that may have produced those particular texts. Within the field of art, representational art, the kind of sort of figurative paintings that had dominated American art during the 1930s, gave way to abstract expressionism, which didn't seem to have any content. It was art for art's sake. Again, to what extent McCarthyism and that sort of fear of becoming politically involved had any impact on these broader cultural tendencies, it's hard to say. I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but I do think we should keep it in the back of our mind. Obviously, the one area in which McCarthyism did have an impact was politics. The 1950s are often viewed as the Big Chill, or to use the language of Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, this was the quote-unquote black silence of fear. There's a big debate among American historians and other scholars, actually a big debate out there among ordinary Americans, about how seriously McCarthyism and the anti-communist political repression of the late 1940s and 50s affected American politics. Some people see it as not having much of an impact at all. McCarthy, the senator, was seen as a kind of deviant character. The movement that he gave his name to was seen as an aberration. It was clearly problematic, but people tended to celebrate the American system. Yes, there were some bad moments in the late 40s and early 50s, but the system handled it. You know, it certainly was not a incredible repression like the one that existed in the Soviet Union at that time. People lost their jobs, but that's not the end of the world. And the Supreme Court eventually reaffirmed the First Amendment. Other people see McCarthyism as having a broader impact, as not being an aberration, but rather part of politics as usual. They see it as having narrowed the political spectrum to such an extent that it became impossible for Americans to criticize the conduct of the Cold War. It became impossible for Americans to envision realistic alternatives to the American status quo. Yes, there still remain pockets of criticism on the left, but they were marginalized. They were not listened to. They had no impact on ordinary American politics. Ultimately, I think the way in which one assesses McCarthyism and the Cold War political repression is going to be determined by one's own political position. We see that today in many different ways that historians are still looking at McCarthyism. It's still contentious, and I think it's contentious because here we're really looking at some very basic political issues with regard to one's own stance toward the American political system today. But, and this is important, there is a consensus that it was a deplorable phenomenon, with only a few exceptions, and we are beginning to see a few exceptions today. Nobody considers Joseph McCarthy to have been anything but a disaster. And so we come to one final question here. Can it happen again? For after all, the history of McCarthyism is a history of political repression within a modern democratic society. And as we analyze it, what we're looking at is a moment in which a democratic society, a liberal society with democratic and liberal institutions, allowed itself to participate in, or at least passively acquiesce in, a moment of real political repression. And I think it's that participation, especially on the part of political elites, on the part of college presidents, Supreme Court justices, congressmen, journalists, and others, that made McCarthyism possible. It's also its diffuse nature that made it possible. Remember, it's not just the Justice Department prosecuting people under the Smith Act. It's also movie studios and local school boards, and the diffuse nature of that political repression made it effective. In addition, and this again is crucial, that political repression was facilitated by the invocation of national security. The notion that there was a critical situation, that somehow the Cold War had created a crisis that made repression possible. Finally, I think secrecy was important here. There was a lot of covering up on everybody's part, and I think that secrecy was an important aspect of the political repression of McCarthyism. So when we look finally at these factors that facilitated the participation of political elites, the diffuse nature of that political repression, the invocation of national security and a sense of emergency, the imposition of secrecy, we have to ask ourselves, could it happen again? And I'm afraid the answer is it might very well. The kind of political repression that we associate with McCarthyism can return, but it's not going to return in the same way. We're not going to see another HUAC. We're not going to see another set of Smith Act prosecutions. Yes, American society can have political repression. I think that's the main lesson we've learned from McCarthyism. And we have to remain alert and vigilant to assure that it doesn't really happen again.
Now that you've completed this course, be sure to test your comprehension by taking the final exam. You'll find the exam on this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com. If you enjoyed this program, the Modern Scholar series from Recorded Books offers courses in a variety of subject areas taught by the world's greatest professors. For example, Professor Lawrence Friedman's Law and Order, A History of the American Legal Experience, which explains the legal systems that have formed and continue to shape our democracy. Call 1-800-636-3399 or visit the course webpage for a free catalog. This course, produced by John J. Alexander, is copyrighted 2004 by Recorded Books, LLC. The lecture text is copyrighted 2004 by Ellen Schrecker. The lectures were recorded under the direction of Matthew Kavnar.